In 1951, 6 years after the end of the Second World War, there were 7 men who were sitting on death row, awaiting their date with an American hangman. In the years after the conflict, there were calls to release convicted war criminals, but the Americans resisted the campaigns to release the Landsberg 7. Landsberg Prison was a site in which hundreds of Nazi war criminals were hanged on the gallows, and the process of execution was very efficient. In the early morning of the 7th of June 1951, one by one the last 7 condemned men were led onto the gallows, and they were then sent crashing through the trapdoor, and were hanged until death was confirmed. But shortly after, the prison was handed back over to the Germans. So why did the Americans insist that the last 7 men of Landsberg were executed? What had these men done which was so awful? Now the 7 condemned men who were awaiting their executions inside of Landsberg Prison were Paul Blobel, Otto Ohlendorf, Oswald Pohl, Werner Braune, Erich Naumann, Hans Schmidt and George Schallermair. These were some of the most disgusting and ruthless war criminals, and they were linked to the crimes of the Einsatzgruppen death squads and also the concentration camps. Paul Blobel would brag throughout World War II about the death tolls he had inflicted upon innocent people. He was an Einsatzgruppen commander and was responsible for organising the Babi Yar massacre, the largest single massacre of the Second World War in September 1941. In just 2 days, over 33,000 people were shot by Blobel's death squads, and he was involved in ensuring the executions were carried out swiftly and quickly. He was given orders to murder entire populations who were being persecuted by the Nazis. In one of his actions it was said that the Wehrmacht had already dug a grave, the children were brought along in a tractor, the guards were standing around trembling, the children were taken down from the tractor, they were lined up at the top of the grave and shot so they fell into it. Blobel's crimes were extensive, and he was also involved in bringing gas chambers to concentration camps, but he ended World War II with a death toll of around 59,000 people, specifically attributed to him. It's believed he himself, with his own hands, killed between 10,000 and 15,000. Blobel was sentenced to death at the Einsatzgruppen trial. Otto Ohlendorf was also a member of the Einsatzgruppen's command structure, and he oversaw Einsatzgruppe D. Under his command, over 90,000 people were murdered in the lands which Ohlendorf operated in, and there was one particular massacre in which at least 14,000 people were shot in a single day in December 1941. Ohlendorf ordered his men to stand in a line and fire at the victims, rather than using a neck shot with a victim lying down on the corpses of those who had gone before. He held many other roles inside of the Reich Security main office, and was with Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, at the end of the war as they tried to escape. He was also sentenced to death at the Einsatzgruppen trial. Oswald Pohl was the head of the SS main economic and administrative office, and he was the head administrator of the concentration camps. He rose throughout the ranks of the Nazi Party and became a close friend of Heinrich Himmler. He was placed in charge of all concentration camps and their exploitation of prisoners for forced labour. He was in control of the finances of the camps too, and his office signed off on the creation of gas chambers and funded them. He went into hiding at the end of the war, but was arrested by the British. He was sentenced to death for war crimes and crimes against humanity, and was left on death row for 4 years. Werner Braune was another Einsatzgruppen commander, and he served inside of Ohlendorf's Einsatzgruppen D. He organised mass murders in the Army Group South rear area, and his forces were involved in the same massacre in which 14,000 were shot in December 1941. At the end of the war he was brought to trial alongside Ohlendorf and Blobel, and it was claimed that various reports implicate Braune and his commando in the sordid business of illegal killings. He was also sentenced to death. Erich Naumann was the commander of Einsatzgruppe 6 and Einsatzgruppe B, and he was responsible for the deaths of 17,256 people in Smolensk. He also used gas vans to exterminate people, and he claimed that by December 1942 his forces had shot 134,298 people. He was also the secret police chief in the Netherlands. When brought to trial, he believed his actions were right, and he was completely unrepentant. He was also sentenced to death. Hans Schmidt was a former adjutant of Buchenwald concentration camp, and he claimed complete ignorance to the crimes of the camp. He was someone who claimed he had done absolutely nothing, and was sentenced to death. The final man was George Schallermair, who was an SS sergeant who also worked inside of Dachau concentration camp, and he too was condemned. Now, in the later part of 1950, there were actually many shocking protests outside Landsberg Prison, where the men were awaiting their deaths and executions. Some claimed that the Americans were executing Germans and that this was wrong, too long after the conflict, and it's believed that the crowds were driven by their Nazi mentality, and they wanted the Landsberg 7 actually released. There was a mob mentality, but the Americans refused to give in, and they then quickly ensured that the paperwork was carried out to make sure that the Landsberg 7 could then be executed efficiently without any questions asked. In the early morning of the 7th of June 1951, within the walls of Landsberg Prison, the American executioner and hangman was ready for his work. He was to bring the lives of the Landsberg 7 to an end professionally and swiftly. The gallows inside of the courtyard stood tall, and on these, over 200 people had already been executed by US executioners. One by one, the men were brought out from their prison cells to the two sets of gallows, and they were surrounded by American military policemen, and they had their identities confirmed at the bottom of the scaffold. After being helped up the steps, they were led below the crossbeam of the gallows, and a priest heard the men's final words. After this, the executioner took them and ensured that he secured the noose well, after placing a cap over their heads. The men had their arms and legs secured so they would fall through the scaffold without moving too much, and then a final photograph was taken. After the lever was pushed and the men fell through the gallows, they were left for some time until death was confirmed by a doctor, and then the next condemned man would then be brought out. The executioner performed his job for a couple of hours until all of the Landsberg 7 were executed and were then lying inside of coffins. The executions of the Landsberg 7 were some of the final executions of the Second World War criminals, and they attracted a significant amount of criticism. But we must remember that these men were some of the most awful beasts of the 20th century, and they had death tolls of thousands of innocent people on their hands. But on the gallows platform, their lives within Landsberg Prison were brought to an end. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.